After my younger sister suffered an allergic reaction from eating the food I cooked, my husband flew into a rage. He grabbed a whole crate of red wine from the house, pinned me down, and forced it into my mouth. You should feel Rosie's pain too. Soon, red rashes spread across my body, and my throat began to swell. On the brink of death, I begged him to call an ambulance, but he locked me in the room instead. Take your time and enjoy it. Only when you suffer enough will you stop hurting others. In despair, I felt my throat closing, and my skin itching unbearably as if pierced by needles. I scratched my skin until there wasn't a single patch of unbroken skin left. 3 days later, he finally decided to show mercy and make it up to me with a candlelit dinner. I bet you have learned your lesson. As long as you behave from now on, you'll still be Mrs. Henderson. However, he would never see me again. By then, my body had already turned to ashes. Blake Henderson idly spun his phone in his hand, the shifting glow from the screen flickering across his handsome face. It had been 3 days, and I still had not called him once. In the past, I used to cling to him every second I could. I guess she finally learned her lesson. Blake chuckled softly. Melinda's tear-streaked face flashed through his mind, only to be quickly replaced by annoyance. Just then his phone rang. Blake picked it up quickly and said, "Melinda, you. Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's room hasn't been cleaned for the past 2 days. The smell is getting quite strong." It was the butler. What trick is she playing now? A trace of disgust flashed in Blake's eyes. Is she trying to force me to go back just like this? Dream on. Hearing his words, the butler hesitated for a moment before saying, "Mrs. Henderson may already." Before he could finish, Blake cut him off. "Leave her alone. Let her fend for herself." Then he hung up the call. Blake frowned and thought about my pale face, tearful and pleading. "Blake, what are you thinking about?" Rosie, who was nestled in his arms, asked in a soft voice. Hearing Rosie's voice, Blake snapped back to reality. He gently stroked her hair and said, "Nothing. I just thought of something unpleasant." "Did my sister upset you again?" Rosie grabbed his hand and looked at him with concern. "I didn't want to punish her. Please don't be mad at her anymore, even though she treated me." As Rosie spoke, her voice trailed off, and her eyes reddened. Seeing her reaction, Blake pulled her into his arms and comforted her. "It's okay, baby. You don't need to speak up for her. She's only trying to get my attention. I won't fall for it again. Don't worry. I won't let her hurt you anymore." But, a faint glint of satisfaction flickered in Rosie's eyes, so brief it was almost impossible to catch. Watching their display of affection, I laughed out of anger, but no one heard it. I was already dead. The moment I stopped breathing, I felt myself drift up above the room. Looking down at the body on the floor, I knew it was me, yet it also felt strangely unfamiliar. I saw my face filled with agony, and my body was a bloodied mess with eyes wide open in terror. What was most ridiculous was that even at the moment of my death, I had still hoped Blake would remember the good in me and come save me. Yet, at that very moment, Blake was at the hospital with Rosie, gently comforting her as she received N4 drip. "Blake, will Melinda be okay?" Rosie's voice sounded as sweet as honey, yet it made me sick. "Relax, she won't die. She's so afraid of death, so what's a little bit of an allergy going to do to her?" Blake replied casually. Hearing that, I froze, and a sharp ache spread through my heart. Rosie had eaten a little peanut, and he had rushed her to the hospital in a panic. On the other hand, I had been forced to drink an entire crate of red wine. Yet he dragged me into a room and locked me inside. I was afraid of dying, so that was why I endured the burning pain of alcohol and struggled desperately to stay alive. After Blake left the room, I dragged myself forward with great difficulty, leaving a clear trail behind me. After great effort, I finally reached the doorknob. However, I realized that he had locked the door from the outside. I tried with all my strength to make a sound, but my throat felt completely blocked. All I could manage were hoarse, rasping gasps. Desperately, I pounded on the door. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound grew weaker and weaker until I no longer had the strength to even lift my hand in the end. Just as my consciousness was about to fade, I heard the butler's voice outside the door. "Mr. Henderson, are you sure you want to do this? If Mrs. Henderson really—" "Shut up. One more word, and you're fired." Blake snapped impatiently. "If she doesn't suffer a bit, she'll never learn." The lack of oxygen made my head buzz violently, and my vision started growing darker. In the end, I could see nothing at all. "Forget it. Let Melinda out. The key is in my study drawer," Blake finally instructed coldly. The butler's expression turned uneasy as he acknowledged the order over the phone. Blake wrapped his arms around Rosie and said guiltily, "To make it up to you, I just bought you a villa in the south of the city. Why don't we go and take a look now?" Rosie's eyes lit up and she excitedly pulled him toward the door. "You promised. I want a pink princess room and a huge garden." Blake smiled and affectionately tapped her nose. "Okay, whatever you want." Along the way, Blake held Rosie's hand tightly, as if pouring all the affection he had into her. Yet for some reason, my face kept surfacing in his mind, refusing to fade. Buzz. In that split second, the vibration of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Blake glanced at it irritably and found that it was the butler. What is it? Mr. Henderson. The butler's trembling voice came through the phone. Mrs. Henderson, she. What now? What is she trying this time? Blake frowned impatiently. Tell her I'm busy and that I don't have time for her games. And no, Mr. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson seems to be. The butler took a deep breath as if gathering all his courage before continuing. It seems she's dead. Dead. Blake's expression instantly turned livid. What the hell are you talking about? Then he suddenly recalled the call from the butler that morning. Could it be that? No, impossible. Melinda had worked so hard to marry me. So how could she possibly die? She must be pretending so she could win my sympathy, Blake thought. Mr. Henderson, I'm not lying. The butler was on the verge of tears. Mrs. Henderson's body is already. If she's dead, then she's dead. She's always been good at pretending to be pitiful to gain sympathy. Are you helping her to deceive me too? But that's enough. Tell her that if she doesn't want to come out, she can stay locked in there. I don't want to hear another word about her. Blake roared and hung up. He cursed inwardly that I had dared to threaten him like this. Blake, did something happen to Melinda? Rosie asked softly. It's nothing. Blake gently patted her back. Don't be soft-hearted with her after what she did to you. Still, she is my sister. Rosie's voice trembled and sounded on the verge of crying. However, I clearly saw the corner of her lips curl into a faint smile. Blake let out a long sigh and stroked her hair softly. You're too kind. That's why she always bullies you. Kind. Rosie. Looking at them, I almost laughed in fury. A few days ago was our 3rd wedding anniversary. I had prepared a table full of Blake's favorite dishes and waited for him with joy. However, what he brought back wasn't a gift or flowers. Instead, it was Rosie, my so-called sister. Rosie clung affectionately to Blake's arm and said sweetly, Melinda, I'm sure you don't mind me here, right? Looking at how close they were, I found it almost unbearable to watch. Blake frowned and said impatiently, why should you care what she thinks? If you want to come, you can. Since when does she get a say? Suppressing my anger, I reminded him coldly, today is our wedding anniversary. So what? Blake sneered, pulling Rosie to sit at the table. If you don't like it, then leave. No one is forcing you to stay. His words were like needles piercing my heart. We had been together for years, yet I still couldn't get a single trace of affection from him in return. After taking a few bites of the food, Rosie's expression suddenly changed. She covered her mouth and began to retch. Seeing her reaction, Blake panicked immediately. What's wrong, Rosie? What happened? She weakly pointed at the dishes in front of her and said with a trembling voice, I'm allergic to peanuts. Melinda, did you put peanut sauce in the food? I didn't. I knew this was clearly another act by Rosie. After all, I hadn't used any peanut sauce at all. Melinda, how could you do this to me? I know you don't like me, but why would you kill me? Melinda, have you lost your mind? Blake roared. He scooped Rosie into his arms and rushed out like a gust of wind. Late at night, Blake returned home. He yanked me off the bed and dragged me into the living room. When I saw a crate of red wine placed in the center of the room, my heart dropped. Blake, what are you doing? I looked at him in terror, my voice trembling. He let out a cold laugh and replied, Melinda, how can you be so vicious? Rosie is so kind, yet you dared to harm her. I'll make you pay for the suffering you caused her. Before I could react, he shoved me violently to the ground. Then the servants pinned me down tightly. I struggled desperately, but it was useless. I didn't harm Rosie. You have to believe me. I cried out in despair. I can't believe you are still making excuses even now. Blake said as he grabbed a bottle of red wine and roughly pried open my mouth, pouring the liquid in. I remember that you are allergic to alcohol. The wine streamed down from the corners of my mouth. I choked violently and could feel my stomach churning in agony. I have a severe alcohol allergy. Even a small amount of it could be fatal. Please don't. I'll die. I begged, but it only made him more ruthless. I never wanted to hurt Rosie. Please believe me. The allergic reaction grew stronger, and my body swelled as if inflated, burning with pain. My throat began to swell shut, making it harder to breathe. I gasped desperately, but the air felt thinner and thinner. At the same time, darkness crept into my vision. In agony, I looked at Blake and tried to beg him to stop. But the moment I opened my mouth, I erupted into violent coughing. My stomach churned, and I could not hold it back. I vomited. When the mess stained his hands, he flung me aside in disgust. You're disgusting. He slapped me twice, making my head spin and my ears ring. Soon, more and more red patches spread across my body, merging into terrifying rashes. I felt like a fish thrown onto land, struggling on the brink of death. However, Blake only looked at me coldly and said, It hurts, doesn't it? Rosie felt the same just now. Then he grabbed my chin and forced me to look at him. I thought you were good at taking care of people. Why couldn't you take care of your sister? I looked at him in despair. Memories of his past tenderness flashed through my mind like a carousel. When I was young and bullied, hiding in a corner and crying, it was Blake who handed me a lollipop and comforted me. Melinda, don't cry. If you eat candy, it won't hurt anymore. Then he went and fought off the people who had bullied me. But that boy who had once treated me so gently had personally pushed me into hell. When Blake finally grew tired of forcing wine down my throat, he grabbed my hair. My scalp throbbed with pain, as if it were about to split open. He yanked me up from the ground and dragged me into the room like a piece of trash. I'll ask you one last time. Are you going to admit that you harmed Rosie? I looked at him in despair. The love I once felt had long since turned into bone-deep coldness. My swollen throat made it impossible for me to say even a single word. On the other end of the line, the butler stared at my decaying body, his face pale. He was so frightened that he nearly dropped his phone. With trembling hands, he called Sarah Lokisevin, Blake's mother. When I saw his actions, I rushed forward and tried to stop him, but my hand passed right through the phone. I didn't want Sarah to see me like this. When I was little, my parents were always busy with business, and often left me with the Henderson family. Sarah pitied me and treated me like her own daughter. She was the only one all these years who never took Rosie's side. My death would already devastate her. I didn't want her to see me in this state, but I no longer had a physical body. All I could do was watch helplessly as the butler made the call. Soon, accompanied by the screech of brakes, Sarah stumbled into the room. I watched as her face filled with terror. Melinda, my dear Melinda. She cried out and rushed toward me. However, I was already a cold corpse. All I could do was watch as she collapsed beside me, her trembling hands reaching out to touch my disfigured face. Melinda, why would this happen to you? The heat had left my body badly decomposed. Sarah tried to close my eyes, but no matter how hard she tried, they remained open. She can't rest in peace. My dear Melinda has suffered so much injustice. Sarah sobbed uncontrollably. She was heartbroken, and there was nothing I could do but watch in despair. Where is Blake? Where is that monster? Sarah demanded through her grief. The butler lowered his head awkwardly. Mr. Henderson hasn't been home for days. With trembling hands, Sarah dialed Blake's number. Blake, where are you? Get back here right now. On the other end, Blake sounded impatient. Did Melinda say something to you again? I've told you before to stop interfering in my affairs. Melinda is dead. Why aren't you home? In that split second, there was a brief silence. Then Blake said, Mom, why are you playing along with her nonsense? Faking her death is ridiculous. Sarah's voice broke into sobs. How many days has it been since you came home? Melinda's body is already decomposing. Do you even know what you've done? There was a flicker of panic in Blake's eyes, but it quickly vanished and was replaced by his usual coldness. Mom, stop playing along with her games. She did all these just because she wants me to come back. I saw allergy medicine on her bedside table myself. If she's going to lie, she should at least make it convincing. What allergy medicine? How did Melinda die? Sarah's voice was filled with disbelief and anguish. Did you hurt her again? Blake, if you did this to her, I will never forgive you. Mom, can you stop being childish? I don't have time to play games with you. Put Melinda on the phone. I want to talk to her, Blake said impatiently. On the other hand, Sarah looked at my cold body and closed her eyes in despair, allowing tears to slide down her cheeks. Blake, you are such a disappointment. The call ended with a harsh click, leaving only the cold, empty tone. I watched as Sarah collapsed weakly beside the bed, her vision blurred by tears. The air inside the Henderson villa was heavy, carrying a sweet, metallic tang that the expensive air filtration system could no longer mask. Sarah stood in the center of the master bedroom, her knuckles white as she gripped the post of the bed. Her eyes were fixed on the deep, irregular scratch marks clawed into the mahogany paint near the base of the doorframe. They were thin dark grooves, some of them stained with dried, blackish red flakes where my fingernails had split against the wood. Beside her, the family doctor, a retired coroner named Dr. Evans whom Sarah had trusted for 30 years, slowly knelt. He wore thick blue latex gloves. Didn't touch my face, he didn't need to. The state of my skin, bloated and covered in a thick, cracked crust of dark red rashes, told the story of my final hours with terrible clarity. Anaphylactic shock, Dr. Evans said, his voice flat, professional, and entirely devoid of the polite deference he usually showed the Henderson family. Combined with acute laryngeal edema, her throat swelled shut. Sarah. It was a slow suffocation. Based on the temperature of the room and the level of decomposition, she has been dead for at least 72 hours. Sarah fell to her knees beside him. Her hand, trembling, reached out toward my blood-stained sleeve, but she stopped it an inch away, her fingers curling into a tight, helpless fist. The butler said he said Blake locked her in, Sarah whispered. Her voice was hollow, a dry, rattling sound that didn't sound like her at all. He forced the wine down her throat. Evans. He knew she was allergic. He knew even a single glass could kill her. If that is true, Dr. Evans said, standing up and pulling off his gloves with a sharp snap, then this is not a medical tragedy, Sarah. This is a homicide. And, as a licensed physician, I am legally required to report this to the medical examiner immediately. Call them, Sarah said. She stood up, her small, frail frame suddenly straightening. The soft, gentle mother-in-law who had always tried to patch things up between Blake and me was gone. In her place stood the matriarch of the Lokesevin family, her eyes cold and sharp as shards of winter ice. Call the district attorney too. Tell him that Arthur Lokesevin's daughter has been murdered in her own bed. The butler, who had been standing by the door, let out a low, terrified whimper. Mrs. Lokesevin. Please, I didn't know. Mr. Henderson told me she was just pretending. You knew she was locked in, Sarah said, not even turning to look at him. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an iron hammer. You heard her pounding on the door, and you did nothing. You are an accessory to the murder of my daughter Henry. You will spend the rest of your life in a concrete cell. I stood beside the window, my transparent fingers hovering over the glass. I looked down at Sarah, then at my own cold, ruined body on the bed. Mom, I thought, the old, childish word rising in my chest like a bubble of air. Don't look at me anymore. It's too dirty. But she couldn't hear me. She only reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number she had memorized since Blake was a boy. The south of the city was a quiet, wealthy district lined with modern, three-story villas made of white limestone and glass. Blake stood in the center of a massive sunlit bedroom, his hands in his pockets, a faint, indulgent smile on his face. The room had been painted a soft, dusty pink, and the large French windows looked out over a manicured garden, filled with imported white roses. Do you like it, Rosie? He asked. Rosie was spinning in the center of the room, her silk sundress billowing around her knees. Her cheeks were slightly pink, her laughter bright and sweet. Oh, Blake. It's perfect. It looks exactly like the castle I used to draw when we were kids. Melinda always said I was too childish to have a room like this, but you always remember. Your sister is a bitter woman, Rosie, Blake said, his brow furrowing slightly. At the mention of my name, she spent her whole life trying to keep you in her shadow because she was jealous of how much everyone loved you. But you don't have to worry about her anymore. This house is yours. But what if she gets mad? Rosie stopped spinning, her lower lip trembling with a well-practiced, fragile anxiety. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers digging into his palm. She's still your wife, Blake. If she finds out you bought me this villa, she'll hurt me again, just like she did with the peanut sauce. She won't touch you, Blake said, his voice dropping to a hard, protective tone. He pulled her into his arms, his chin resting on her soft hair. I've told the staff to keep her locked in her room until she signs the divorce papers. Once the papers are filed, she'll be nothing but a stranger to this family. Suddenly, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out irritably, expecting another call from his mother or the butler, trying to play along with my death stunt. But the name on the screen was different. It was Assistant District Attorney Vance, a man who had handled the Henderson Group's corporate compliance filings for years, and a close personal friend of his mother's family. Vance, Blake said, his voice returning to its casual, professional pitch. I'm a bit busy today. If this is about the harbor development permits. Blake. Vance's voice was flat, cold, and entirely devoid of the usual warmth he showed him during their golf games. Where are you? Blake frowned, his hand tightening around the phone. I'm at the South Side development site. Why? The municipal police and the county coroner have just issued an emergency arrest warrant in your name, Vance said. The charges are first-degree murder and domestic abuse resulting in death. They are currently tracking your vehicle's GPS. Blake let out a short, incredulous laugh. Murder? What the hell are you talking about, Vance? Is this another one of my mother's sick jokes? If Melinda's been crying to her again. Melinda is dead, Blake, Vance interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, heavy register. Her body was discovered 3 hours ago by your mother. The coroner's preliminary report states she died of asphyxiation and systemic anaphylaxis due to forced alcohol ingestion. The police have already secured the locked bedroom door as evidence, and the servants have confessed that you ordered them to pin her down while you forced the wine into her mouth. The phone in Blake's hand suddenly felt very cold. He stared at the pink wall of the bedroom, his mind stalling. Dead. No. That's impossible. She's too afraid of death. She's always been so careful about her allergies. She wouldn't just die. She had her allergy medicine on the nightstand, Blake stammered, his voice losing its steady, arrogant tone for the first time. I saw it myself. If she really had in reaction, she would have taken it. The medicine on her nightstand was an empty bottle of vitamin supplements that had been relabeled Blake, Vance said. The county forensic team has already bagged it. Your wife had no access to epinephrine or antihistamines. You locked her in a room without a phone, without medication, and with a swollen throat. Blake. Rosie asked, her voice soft and tentative as she touched his arm. What's wrong? You look pale. Blake didn't answer her. He slowly lowered the phone, his eyes fixed on the white roses in the garden outside the window. Through the glass, he could hear the faint, distant wail of police sirens rising from the boulevard below. The interrogation room of the precinct was cold, smelling of stale coffee and industrial floor wax. Blake sat behind the metal table, his hands cuffed to the iron bar in the center. His designer suit was wrinkled, his hair slightly messy, but the arrogant, defensive set of his jaw was still there. This is a conspiracy, he said to the detective sitting opposite him. My mother has always preferred Melinda. She's using her connections to frame me for a domestic dispute. Melinda was faking her reaction to get my sympathy, and when she realized I wasn't coming back, she must have taken something else. The door to the room opened, and Detective Vance walked in, holding a blue folder of medical documents. Blake, Vance said, sitting down next to the detective. I suggest you stop talking. Your lawyers are outside, but they've already seen the preliminary forensics. If you continue to claim Melinda took something else, you are only going to make the jury's decision easier. What forensics? Blake demanded, his eyes narrowing. Vance opened the blue folder, sliding 3 sheets of paper across the metal table. The medical examiner completed the gastric audit of the deceased this morning. Vance said. There was no food in her stomach, Blake. The anniversary dinner she prepared, the one Rosie claimed contained the peanut sauce, was untouched. In fact, we tested the dishes left on the dining table. There was no peanut sauce in any of them. The oil used was standard olive oil, and there were no traces of peanut proteins in the kitchen. Blake stared at the papers, his mind struggling to connect the words. But Rosie had in reaction. She was retching. She pointed at the dishes. We subpoenaed Rosie's medical records from the hospital you took her to that night, Vance continued, his voice cold and steady. The attending physician's report states that Rosie's blood tests showed 0 anaphylactic markers. Her throat was not swollen, her skin showed no hives, and her oxygen levels were at 99%. The reaction she had was entirely subjective. In medical terms, she was faking. No, Blake whispered, his head shaking. No, Rosie wouldn't do that. She's too kind. She's always been the victim. Rosie has a history of somatic symptom disorders and falsified medical claims, dating back to her high school days, Blake, Vance said, pulling another document from the folder. When she was 16, she claimed Melinda had pushed her down the stairs, but the school's security footage showed her stepping down and throwing herself onto the landing. Your mother knew about this. That's why she never trusted her. I stood behind Blake, my transparent hand resting lightly on his shoulder. I could feel the sudden, rapid spike in his heart rate, the cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. She lied to you, Blake. I whispered into his ear, though my voice was nothing but the draft from the air vent. She wanted my husband, she wanted my house, and she wanted my life. And you gave them to her on a silver platter. Blake stared at the medical report, his chest heaving. The perfect, fragile image of the innocent sister he had protected for years was beginning to dissolve, revealing the ugly, rotting skeleton of a malicious lie. Where is Rosie? He asked, his voice shaking. Rosie is currently being detained in the adjacent wing, Vance said, closing the folder. She's already signed a preliminary statement. She's claiming that she had no idea you were going to lock Melinda in the room, and that she begged you to call an ambulance. She's shifting the entire blame onto you to avoid being charged as an accessory. Blake let out a low, strangled gasp, his head falling forward against the metal table. The angel he had killed his wife for had just cut his throat to save herself. The trial of Blake Henderson was the largest scandal the city's high society had seen in 50 years. The gallery of the county court was packed with journalists, former business partners, and the wealthy families who had once envied our perfect marriage. But there was no envy in the room now. There was only the cold, clinical curiosity of people watching a monster being dissected. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing a simple, high-collared black dress, her face veiled in dark lace. She didn't look at her son as he was led into the courtroom in his orange prison jumpsuit. The prosecution calls Dr. Evans to the stand, the district attorney announced. For 3 days, the jury was forced to look at the photos of my room, the claw marks on the door, the blood-stained rug where I had dragged myself forward, and the disfigured, swollen face of the girl who had once been the pride of the Lokesevin family. The level of suffering the deceased experienced was extreme, Dr. Evans testified, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. The lack of epinephrine meant her body was essentially drowning in its own fluids. The scratching on her skin was a localized reaction to the intense, burning itch of the histamines, a sensation patients describe as being pierced by thousands of hot needles. She did not die instantly, Your Honor. She spent at least 18 hours in that room, begging for help that never came. Several members of the jury turned their heads away from the projection screen. Blake sat at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked pale, hollow, and 20 years older than he had a month ago. He didn't look like the powerful, untouchable CEO of the Henderson Group anymore. He looked like a prisoner waiting for his sentence. On the fourth day, Rosie took the stand. She wore a modest, dark blue dress, her hair pinned back neatly, her eyes red and tear-streaked as she looked at the jury. I didn't know, she sobbed into her handkerchief. I swear I didn't know he was going to lock her in. I thought he was just going to talk to her. When I saw the red wine, I was so scared. I told him to stop, but he was so angry. He's always had a terrible temper. He was obsessed with protecting me, even when I didn't want him to. You lying bitch. Blake suddenly screamed, standing up and slamming his cuffed hands against the table. You're the one who told me she put peanuts in the food. You're the one who said she wanted to kill you. You set this whole thing up. Order. The judge roared, slamming his gavel. Mr. Henderson, seat yourself or you will be removed from the courtroom. She's lying. Blake shrieked, his face distorted with a wild, desperate rage as the bailiffs forced him back into his chair. She faked the reaction. The doctor's report said so. She wanted Melinda dead so she could have the Southside villa. Rosie didn't answer him. She only shrank back into the witness stand, her shoulders shaking with soft, delicate sobs that made the jury look at Blake with even greater disgust. I stood beside Sarah, my hand resting on her shoulder. Mom, I thought, looking at Blake's pathetic display. It's over. He's finally realized what he destroyed. But it won't bring me back. Sarah let out a long, quiet sigh, her hand reaching up to touch the dark lace of her veil. She knew. Even without a ghost beside her, she knew that justice had finally come to the house of Henderson. 6 months after my death, the Henderson villa was put up for auction by the county sheriff's office to pay off the massive civil liability suit Sarah had filed on behalf of my family's estate. The grand living room, where the crate of red wine had once sat in the center of the room, was empty and dusty. The furniture had been cleared out, leaving nothing but the faded squares on the carpet where the sofas had once been. Blake sat in a 6-by-9-foot cell in the state penitentiary, his hands resting on his knees. He had been sentenced to life without the possibility of parole for first-degree murder and domestic abuse. Rosie had been sentenced to 5 years as an accessory and for perjury, her delicate health failing her within the first week of her transfer to the women's facility. The prison was quiet at night, the only sound the low, rhythmic hum of the distant exhaust fans and the heavy metallic clink of the guard's keys. Blake closed his eyes, trying to sleep. But the moment the darkness came, the smell of red wine would fill his throat. He would feel a sudden, suffocating tightness in his chest, and in the silence of the cell, he would hear a soft, scraping sound coming from the metal door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was the sound of fingernails dragging against wood, slow, desperate, and eternal. He opened his eyes in a panic, his breathing ragged, his forehead covered in cold sweat. He stared at the iron door of his cell, his hands shaking. Melinda. He whispered into the dark. Melinda, please. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But there was no answer. The ghost of the girl he had murdered was no longer in his house. She was not in the Pink Princess room. She was not in the courtroom, and she was certainly not in his cell. I had already turned to ashes, and the wind had carried me far away from his prison, back to the quiet, sunny gardens of my childhood where the boy with the lollipop had once lived. The boy was safe in my memory. The monster in the cell was left entirely alone, with nothing but the smell of red wine and the sound of the scratching in the dark.